Good afternoon and welcome back to the Global Goals 2020 Symposium. I hope you have been enjoying some of the 9 panel sessions that were scheduled this morning, as well as our social lunch dedicated to early career researchers just now. My name is Carole-Anne Sénit, and I have the great honor to chair the second plenary session of the Global Goals 2020 Symposium entitled The Universal Aspiration of the Sustainable Development Goals. I can see that 90 attendees I've tuned in this afternoon to explore with us whether the 2030 agenda and the SDGs allow for global inclusiveness and equity within and between countries. 3 distinguished speakers are joining us to discuss this question. Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya from the Center for Policy Dialogue, who has logged in from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Sheila Oparaocha, hopefully soon now, from the Dutch-based NGO Energia. And last but definitely not least, Sébastian Treyer, Executive Director of IDRI, who's joining us from Paris. But before I introduce more in detail our first panelist and give him the floor, let me once again guide you through the guidelines for participation in this plenary session. So to ask your questions, please type them in the Q&A box. And remember that this is possible throughout the keynote presentation. You're welcome to do that, as I said, during all the presentation, and you may also add your affiliation and the name of the panelists you wish to address. As an attendee, you can upvote question that you'd like to see answered by clicking on the thumb up icon, and this icon appears under each question that has been typed in the Q&A box.
Yes.
With the help of my colleague Thomas Hickman, I will select the questions and post them to our panelists after the last presentation. And finally, remember that for security reasons, you cannot see other attendees and mute yourself or launch your own video. And now, without further ado, I am extremely happy to welcome Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya. So Deb is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka. He is also a former ambassador and permanent representative of Bangladesh to the World Trade Organization and also to the UN offices in Geneva, and is also special advisor on the least developed countries to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Dr. Bhattacharya is also the chair of Southern Voice, which is a network of 51 think tanks from Africa, Latin America, and Asia, which objective is to promote and disseminate the knowledge of Global South researchers on the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, Deb will share with us the core findings of an initiative led by Southern Voice on the global state of the Sustainable Development Goals, and will explore the second generation challenges of SDG delivery and their implications for inclusiveness. Dr. Bhattacharya, you can now take the floor for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. Thank you. Let me start by complimenting all my colleagues at Utrecht University for this fantastic initiative, and my greetings to all those who have joined me, and my compliments to my fellow panelists. The subject which I'm going to talk about today has essentially 3 dimensions. The first one is that what do we see on the basis of what are the major conclusions coming out from the first 4 or 5 years of SDG implementation in the developing countries. And number 2 is that what are the major lessons which leads us to the second generation challenges which we would be confronting with in post 2020. And the third, and not the least, no less important, is now that the COVID-19, the new pandemic, is all over us, what actually it means in terms of addressing the concern of leave no one behind, and how do you reformulate those things. So these are the 3 major issues I would like to bring to you within the next 10-12 minutes. The first issue, as you see on this slide, that there are 5 issues which were the major problems dealt with by the developing countries while implementing SDGs. The first one was the policy alignment. How do you align? There were a number of linguistic issues or vocabulary over here: alignment, localization, mainstreaming, all those things, but I prefer the word alignment. National policy aligning with the global agenda. The second one is to set up an institutional mechanism to oversee this implementation, which is quite different from the MDGs. The finding adequate resources was a great challenge, and it remains so. Data deficit in terms of both for planning, implementation, and assessment has been a great problem. Multi-stakeholder partnership, not only within the government, but with the private sector and with the non-government organizations, CSOs, had been also a major issue. So these are the 5 stylized problems coming out from the first 4 years or 5 years of implementation experience in the more or less low-income countries and low-middle-income countries, as we have observed. Let's move on, and you will see the next slide, please. And the issue was that how do you really frame it, or how do you really actually put it into policies and programs, and also in your monitoring and evaluation, the major aspiration of the SDGs, that is leave no one behind. That how do you really define that? There are thousands of definitions on that. I won't go into those, but it was quite easy, quite obvious that the traditional poverty-based assessment, even the multi-dimensional poverty assessment or approach, is not good enough for this. So as you see, the dimensions which we put over here before you visually, they have to be vulnerable, they're marginalized, they're deprived, they're excluded, they're discriminated against, and also they're located furthest from the development frontier. So how do you reach the furthest? That would have been a major issue on that. Let's get into the next slide, please. So if you get to the next slide, the conceptualization of the problem which we have done is that we picked up vulnerability as the criteria. But what vulnerability is essentially means they're prone to shocks of various order. So you will see the different types of shocks induced. One is shock induced. It is essentially climate change or for that matter flood or earthquake, whatever it is. But you have a life cycle issue. The old people are more prone to this of vulnerabilities. Your geographical location, your health status, your occupation, your identity, religion and ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. All these things are all very important. So we picked up 12 criteria which will define a vulnerability in order to apply it and see who are the most vulnerable within that country and within that particular context. Next, please. So what is the essence, what we got out of that? Those who are left behind, they don't have just one single vulnerability. The lesson is that they are multi-dimensional vulnerability and overlapping vulnerability. And we see that one vulnerability invites or begets other vulnerability. Misfortune doesn't come alone. So here you will see that. But it is also very important that the country context. In certain countries, it is the indigenous people who are the most vulnerable one. In other cases, it's the riverbank erosion, and the people on the riverbanks are the more vulnerable one. But what came out very interestingly in all these studies, the location, gender, marginalized group, etc., all there, the income becomes really an important issue. Here it is the correspondence with the poverty issues, but that is exactly not the adequate or the fuller the scope of vulnerability. Income is important, but education turns out to be no less important. Skills and education turns out to be no less important. Your identity as a third gender or anything else is also very, very important. So it's a very complex one, and it's very contextual. So you cannot say globally a general sentence that this group of people are all left behind. There may be some overlap, but not necessarily over there. Please, the next one. So during this study, what we have seen, that 2 major issues which were coming up, and we really did not see them being addressed during the policy alignment or the policy discourse. These are the trade-off issue, because the SDGs are not all additive. There are trade-offs. Growth and energy is one obvious case. Energy and climate change, another obvious case. So if the trade-offs were not captured in most cases, so the second generation challenge, along with redefining the LNOB, as I will come more in the future, in the next slides, trade-off between goals and trade-off, please go back a bit, play trade-off between goals, whether at national level or at household level, that is a very important one. How do you do that and empirically assess that? And the second issue, which was not very much addressed, was the global systemic concern. Because in a globalized world, whatever we do for the poor in one country is affected by the global processes, whether it is trade, whether it is aid, it is investment, it is nowadays, it is access to health products. So all these things are very much there. Intellectual property right will become important as we get a vaccine. So all these issues were very, very important. So these are the two issues, plus the redefined leave no one behind, are the major second generation problems, as we will see in the coming days. Please come, you can go. Now, next one. Now, what is happening with the COVID now on board, which none of us really anticipated, and then it is there and it is staying much longer than we expected, and may stay longer even more. We don't know how the frontier, whether it is a herd immunization or it is the vaccine, whichever will give us the salvation. But the point is, what we see, there are two trends. The first, during the COVID lockdown period, we are seeing deepening of the pre-existing vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities I have mentioned before are getting deeper and deeper because they're getting exacerbated in the process. And the second, which is that this is the new challenge, that redefining the leave no one behind, is the emergence of new vulnerabilities. And this is happening due to health shocks, and it is also happening due to livelihood shocks. The issue is whether these vulnerabilities are transient or they are semi-permanent. That is to be seen. And we see these vulnerabilities in at two levels or at two approaches. One is the immediate emergency, and another is when there is partial opening up of the lockdowns. Then whether these kind of vulnerabilities will persist or they may re-emerge in certain different forms. Please. Now, let me give you an example of what it exactly means. Deepening of the pre-existing vulnerabilities. I give you an example, bringing from a wide range of developing countries, and it's a gender perspective I'm putting before you. I put before you 5 very obvious expression of exacerbation of the pre-existing vulnerabilities. The dropout rate of girl child has increased, and it is going to increase further in the coming days. The early marriage, child marriage is increasing in most of the cases because of the lack of income and everything else. The very reason why the child dropout rate is increasing. There is diminished nutrition to female members in the household, and child delivery is happening without medical attendance because pregnant women are worried to go to hospitals, afraid of getting infected by coronavirus. And last but not the least, there is a huge increase in domestic violence in the house, in these poorer households because of lack of income and other problems which they are seeing. So you see, this 5 will give you a very clear idea. What do I mean by, the deepening of the pre-existing vulnerabilities within among the women? So now let us come to how do you define the new vulnerables? This is a major analytical challenge at this moment. How do you the vulnerability here is defined by your impact level. And impact, how you define that, whether it is by life, fatality, or it is by loss of income and other things we can say. So on the one is that the impact, that exposure, and the other part is your coping capacity, your resilience. So when you deduct one from the other, if your coping capacity is much less, obviously your impact through exposure is much higher. So how do you really define those people? How do you identify them? The left behind, the new left behind. I call them the new poor. Huh? There had been the new rich, then there's a new poor. So there are 2 ways which we are discussing at this moment, both globally and nationally, is that whether we relate it to the poverty line. For example, 20% of the people in one country is poor. Do we add another 20% and say they are semi-poor and they have lost their entitlement during this period because there were only 1.5 times more, so whether they are back into the poor category of that? This is one way of looking at it. But as I have said, I'm not a great fan of, not in favor of just copying the multidimensional or the income level income poverty approach in the leave no one behind. It's much more complex. So what we suggest is that whether we go through the labor market dynamics, whether the person has become, and how do you look at it? We look at through occupation, go through the various categories of occupation, permanent, temporary, full-time, part-time, with a contract, without a contract, and there are others. And what we have observed that the linkage activities, the tertiary sector, the service sector got affected quite a lot, which we haven't seen it before in other cases during other depression or recession in that way. Last but not the least, the role of the public intervention, whether the monetary policies, the liquidity to be given to the banking sector and others, and fiscal policy, whether it's cash transfers, other entitlement support, or tax rebates, and etc. So how do you, this is the policy measures, the public policy interventions is going to somehow diminish the impact or the negative impact on these people, and you'll have to take into account over there. Let us come to the last slide. The issue is, we have now seen through our rapid surveys over there, this is a false dichotomy, life versus livelihood. If life is without a livelihood is no life, because you'll have to have sustenance. So role of the state, role of the society, the role of the social support system, these are all important over there. So this is for us, it is a false dichotomy. But what we see now is a growing new agenda for leave no one behind. I have identified 3 for you over here. One is the investment in public health system. It is only 1 or 2, less than 2% in all the countries, and low-income countries is 1% of the GDP which have gone into the health sector. We were very much in the public, visible infrastructure projects as the sign of progress. So in public health system investment has come back in the agenda. Strengthening the entitlement through minimum income. This is another debate which is globally now on, is very much back. And the idea that earlier it was a safety net program for the most vulnerable. Now we are talking about an universal social protection system. If you have to give some credit to COVID-19, so if this, the misfortune has brought in something, it has given us a new opportunity to redefine the public policy agenda. Please, for the last slide. So my last point is that as the second generation public policy issue, or the SDG assessment, is the global issue. So we cannot expect that to reach out to the left behind people without a global compact. And the whole global goals is all about the global partnership of common but differentiated responsibility. But what we have seen, this is an experience, we have seen dysfunctional global institution. I don't have to explain it to you. Whether it is WTO or it is the UN Security Council, you know that. Disarray in global health response, whether it WHO, not necessarily in one of the powerful person's sense, but it is in general, where there could have been a much more stronger, robust global health response. IFIs, the World Bank, IMFs, and others turned at the regional development bank started to be more agile, more up to more responsive than the bilaterals at this moment. One of the reasons that the bilaterals themselves are seized by this COVID-19, and we also see some new energy in the South-South cooperation. It is not only China or India, it is Bangladesh producing the PPE for the other countries, and also various kinds of medicines which are going around. It's only the other day, the aeroplane landed in Dhaka from Ghana to get a medicine from Bangladesh, Remdesivir, for one of the governors in that country over there. So new forms of South-South cooperations are coming into play in the context of dysfunctional global institution and disarray in global responses. So I think the agenda has just become more complex, and it will demand more intellectual inputs. And I think this discussion is just to the point, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks a lot, Deb, for this very instructive presentation. Let me quickly share my screen again. There we go. So your talk actually resonated a lot with the research that Professor Bierman and myself are undertaking right now on the vulnerabilities of these developed countries. And what we actually learned from the Southern Voice initiative is that gender is a critical exclusion marker in many countries and determines access to several public goods, such as quality education, decent work, but also sustainable energy, which is the focus of our next panelists. Sheila, Oparaocha, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay, so great. This is great. I'm very happy then to welcome Sheila Oparaocha. Sheila has 18 years of working experience in the gender and energy sector. Currently, she is the international coordinator and program manager of the Energia International Network on Gender and Sustainable Energy. Sheila also co-chairs the technical advisory group that has been convened by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs to review progress on SDG 7 and its interlinkages with other SDGs. Today, Sheila will share her insights on gender in the transition to sustainable energy for all. Sheila, you may now share your screen. I will stop sharing mine, and the floor is yours for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
We cannot see your screen yet.
Just confirm that you can see my screen, please. Okay, thank you very much, because I can't. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to provide a perspective to this important research symposium on gender in the transition.
Excuse me, we cannot.
Hello, can you hear me?
We cannot see your screen as yet. Have you shared it?
You can see my screen? I've shared it. Okay, I will try again. Okay. Okay.
Yes, now it should be working.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. Okay. So yes, like I said, I'm pleased to provide a perspective to this important research symposium on gender in the transition to sustainable energy for all from the perspective of a gender and development organization. Energia was established in 1996 with the objective of mainstreaming in the energy sector policies and programs in developing countries. It has emerged as a leading international network and played a key role in establishing gender and energy as a credible issue. Today, Energia implements a multi-country, multi-partner program spanning 18 countries in Asia and Africa. My key message for today is that energy policies that do not include both women and men cannot achieve sustainable energy for all. Progress has been made on gender and on the gender and energy nexus, but not enough to reach SDG 7 objective of universal access to energy by 2030. This group is indeed familiar with the 2030 agenda, but let me review a few special features with regards to energy. First of all, different from the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals for the first time included a standalone goal on energy adopted by member states. SDG 7 includes targets that cut across both development and climate change agendas. Target 7.1 to ensure universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. Target 7.2 to increase substantially the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. And target 7.3 to double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. Further, SDG 7 includes recognition of the dynamic interlinkages with other goals for which sustainable energy for all is essential in order to achieve. These include SDGs on climate, water, health, food, and of course on gender. Another special feature of SDG 7 that is of particular importance to women is that for the first time, clean cooking is set on an equal footing with electricity. The proportion of populations with access to electricity and the proportion of populations with primary reliance on clean fuels and technology are two indicators of the 7.1 target on universal access to energy. It is also noted that the gender narrative in the SDG 7 dialogue has changed over the past 5 years. Notable indicators of this progress that I wish to highlight today are that the UN Women and several international organizations recognize SDG 7 as a key enabler to SDG 5 on gender equality and women's empowerment in their narratives and in their documentation and policies. The global agenda for accelerated SDG 7 actions proposed by the Technical Advisory Group convened by UNDESA to inform the intergovernmental dialogues at the high-level political forum positions women as leaders and change agents in the energy transition as energy technology designers, planners, decision makers, employers, and entrepreneurs, rather than as victims and beneficiaries of energy access. A gender strategy and gender action plan is now required for funding by the climate investment funds. At the regional level, in West Africa, 15 ECOWAS countries have committed to the ECOWAS policy for gender mainstreaming and energy access to address existing barriers that hinder the equal participation of women and men in expanding energy access in the region. Electricity utilities, notably Kenya Power and Nepal Electricity Authority, and other energy companies are implementing gender diversity policies for boards and family-friendly human resource policy for employees. At the national level, several government agencies have also taken strong measures in the energy planning. An analysis of energy policy frameworks of 139 countries with respect to the inclusion of gender revealed that 20 national policies commit to either mainstream gender or to promoting gender equality as a leading objective, while 25 others recognize gender differences in energy access and use. The government of Kenya's standalone gender and energy policy, launched in November 2019, that seeks to raise the level of awareness, change attitudes, and incubate an engendered work culture amongst staff in the energy sector, best practice for other countries.
Sheila, Sheila, excuse me, could you perhaps turn off your video?
Yes.
Your connection appears to be very bad, yes, and we barely understand what you're saying. Yeah, perhaps try to
okay.
stop your video and.
Might help if I can get mic. Hello, did you want me to stop the video?
Let us see how it goes now with the mic.
Can you
I'm afraid it's not the mic, the connection, but let's see.
Okay, so I'm going to have to end the show because I cannot.
Yeah, it's not the mic, it's the video. It's the connection. So perhaps you could
okay, I'm going
turn
to
off your video to see if the connection is better. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I'm trying to stop the video. It's just not. It's not operating with me. I keep pressing it and it's not doing anything. Are you going to switch off the video from your end? It's not allowing me to stop my video. I don't know why. I'm going to stop sharing. Maybe that will stop my video. Oh, I don't know what to.
Okay, can you please?
I apologize about this. Shall I just try to continue?
Yes, please. Proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. It's taking a minute for me to share my screen. Just waiting for that. Okay, now I'm having a problem sharing my screen. Okay, so I'll just, in the interest of time, I will try to get back to sharing my screen. You also have my PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if you could share it from your end.
Yes, yes, we will share it with the participants. Yeah. It's much better now that you have turned off your video. It's much better. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, it's just that you can't see my screen. I'm trying to share it, but it's not. Okay, I think the share button has come on, so I should be ready to go in just a minute or two. Can you see my screen now, and can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Anyway, the point I was trying to make is that Energia is the position that we're giving is based on our engagement with the SDG 7 community. Okay. In spite of all that, in spite of all the progress that I've mentioned, it's a pity to see that we still have gaps. The 2020 tracking SDG 7, the Energy Progress Report that was launched last week by the SDG 7 custodians showed that globally, 789 million people have no access to electricity and 2.8 billion people do not have access to clean cooking. Even more worrying is that the report states that without sustained and increased efforts, 620 million people will still live without access to electricity and 2.2 billion people will not have access to modern energy cooking services in 2030. Also, while great gains have been made in making renewable energy solutions affordable, amongst all houses using an off-grid solar product today, approximately 50% remain below the Tier 1 axis, which is commonly defined as the minimum level to qualify as electricity access. This scenario jeopardizes the achievement of SDG 7 and the progress across related SDGs. And unfortunately, women continue to carry the worst burden of the energy access gap with the following significant impacts. According to WHO, more than 4.3 million deaths every year, mostly amongst women and children, are linked to fumes from fuels such as wood, animal waste, and charcoal, which are used for cooking and heating. Worldwide, 289,000 women die every year from pregnancy and childbirth-related complications, many of which could be averted with the provision of better lighting and other electricity-dependent medical services. Similarly, according to ILO, globally women perform 76% of total hours of unpaid work, more than 3 times as much as men, which are exacerbated by the lack of power for households and subsistence tasks that are time-consuming and demand heavy physical labor. There's also a notable lack of investments for gender in the energy sector, as reported by the OECD DAC Network on Gender Equality in 2019, which noted based on the DAC members reporting on the gender equality policy markers that only 3% of DAC members' aid with the gender equality and women empowerment focus is in the energy sector. Indeed, removing these barriers is a prerequisite for women to invest in education, their agency and life choices, along with freeing them up to seize income earning opportunities and to participate in economic, political and social life. As we had heard from the previous speaker, the current COVID-19 pandemic has thrown a spotlight on gender inequalities in progress towards SDG 7 to date. In May this year, Energia carried out a literary review of COVID-19 publications developed both for gender and for energy audiences, and produced the first briefing paper on the intersectionality of gender, energy, and COVID-19, which you can find posted on our website. Our findings showed that women are on the front lines of the COVID virus pandemic. They need modern and affordable energy to keep up the fight and to support the recovery so that they can make their communities and businesses more resilient. Our SDG 7 policy brief thus calls on policymakers to include mitigations for gender-based vulnerabilities in COVID-19 energy response plans, including against gender-based violence, to integrate clean cooking and fast-track electricity access for health facilities in government pandemic emergency response plans, to improve affordability to electrical appliances and the ability to pay via promotion, flexible payments, appliance rentals, targeted subsidies, to increase women's access to protection messaging by powering communication appliances such as solar radios and mobile phone chargers, to ensure COVID-19 social protection packages salvage operations for women energy enterprises and for their productive activities, to promote gender differentiated energy company organizations support policies practice for remote working and operations. To conclude, I'd like to reach out to the audience of researchers at this symposium and urge your attention to research and advocacy needs to reach the SDG 7 objectives. While Energia acknowledges and appreciates that a lot of research has been done on gender and energy linkages, particularly in the last 3 to 4 years, it is our opinion that we still do not have an agreed approach to measure progress on gender within the SDG 7 indicators. And because of this, the good work done has not yet informed the SDG 7 intergovernmental dialogue to the extent required or that it could have. As a way forward, we thus propose a pilot to help build a consensus proposal amongst key stakeholders on indicators of gender inclusion in SDG 7 that is informed by state-of-the-art empirical evidence on the situation of women, poor and vulnerable communities at national and global level. This would also have to be complemented by a political process to get gender and energy targets on the radar of member states and UN organizations. Energia is eager to partner with researchers and practitioners, including those participating in this symposium, to continue to advance towards sustainable energy for all so that no one, including women, are left behind. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sheila, for sharing your insights on your daily civil society work. And apologies for the technical issues that we've been experiencing at the beginning of Sheila's presentation. So I see that there are already some questions in the Q&A box, and we'll address them later after our last panelist presentation. And I invite also participants to keep asking questions, keep typing in questions in the Q&A box. So let me share my screen again. I am now thrilled to welcome Sébastian Treyer. Sébastian is the Executive Director of IDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. He is a specialist in foresight for public policies and international negotiations on sustainable development. Prior to joining IDRI, he was in charge of foresight at the French Ministry of the Environment. Today, Sébastian will explore the links between environmental emergency and the reduction of inequalities and advocate for specific national pathways to achieve transformation towards sustainability. Sébastian, I now invite you to share your screen, and the floor is yours for 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you all. Good morning and good night for those who are on other continents. Thanks again for the organization of this very important symposium. I really congratulate you at Utrecht University. And I'm so happy to see so many colleagues, and Carole-Anne, you've been a former colleague. It's a pleasure to see you in such an important project. I think I want to complement the presentations given by Deb and by Sheila, particularly focusing, as Carole-Anne has stated, on something that I think is a little bit too implicit in Agenda 2030, that is linking environmental integrity and the notion of inequalities and exclusion. And I want to make it more explicit, and particularly also trying to make it more explicit in the way that it could or should work as a political theory of change. That's going to be majoritarily what I want to talk about. And the thing that to me links environmental integrity and inequalities has a lot to do with vulnerability and the concept that Deb has put on the table that is particularly relevant in developing countries, but I think it's also very relevant in emerging and developed countries. The other element that I will be focusing on is to say, actually, I will look at the 5 years that have passed since the adoption of SDGs as years that we have passed majoritarily in finding the tools, the conceptual tools for the implementation of Agenda 2030, and that we now have 10 years ahead of us to make it work better. And the review of the HLPF that is supposed to undergo, I know that the virtual meeting of the HLPF in July is not going to be, the fact that it's virtual is not going to help a lot, but we have a room for maneuver there to be much more explicit about the type of political theory of change that we expect if we want really the agenda to function in a way that is inclusive, both within and between countries, as is exactly the purpose of this session. So my first point is really to say, if we look at inclusiveness in the way that Agenda 2030 has been implemented, my first point is to say it's a wonderful agenda 2030. It's as inclusive as it could be, because it's been really the finest products of multilateral negotiation and coordination. And multilateral to me is for the moment the best way we have to try and build something inclusive between countries and between citizens of the world, actually. It's imperfect, but it's the most important one. But since then, we have really noticed that this multilateral arrangement of rules-based system is particularly fragile and endangered. So we need to look at both the implementation efforts, but at the same time, at the fact that a lot of events, a lot of strategies have questions the rules-based system. That is the root way, the fundamental way in which the whole Agenda 2030 is supposed to be at least inclusive between countries. The geopolitical tensions that have increased is particularly worrying. At the same time, the crisis of COVID, as Pam Chazek told us in the plenary yesterday, is really, on the contrary, showing to what extent you cannot isolate from global public goods management. And so to some extent, we are in a critical moment where you might have fears that the system for the implementation of Agenda 2030 is actually weakened by the questioning of the international rules-based system. On the other hand, there might be an opportunity with the crisis. The last thing I want to really insist on, and that's going to be one key message of my talk, is to say, really let's us look at SDGs compared to MDGs as a politically much more ambitious project. To me, it sounds like a miracle that inclusiveness is so explicitly present, particularly with the SDG 10 on inequalities, which is a specific way to look at the question of inclusiveness. I know that it's not just a miracle. Carole-Anne has done a lot of her paper, for instance, on how has civil society thought and strategized in order to have SDG 10 included in the Agenda 2030. And I also want to mention that one of the things that is lacking in Agenda 2030 is it's really not explicitly linked to the rights-based approach. So there are issues of inclusiveness that are not enough stated in Agenda 2030. So it's politically much more ambitious than MDGs to include the notion of exclusion or inclusiveness, but it's still not enough. And Sheila has taught us also, of course, of the very, I talk of SDG 10 on inequalities, but the SDG on gender is, of course, very important also. The other thing that I want to say is really the heart of my message. Agenda 2030 is very important, and it's still very valid even in the context of the recent crisis, both the geopolitical, the racial crisis, the crisis on racism, and the COVID crisis, because it's really through the interactions between the SDGs. It's really essentially saying it's an imperative to tackle jointly the climate, the environmental integrity, the inequalities and poverty reduction, and all the SDGs. By saying so, Agenda 2030 is a political project that says you can't deal with one SDG without looking at the other, which means that you have to look at the root causes of the vulnerability of our global socio-ecological system. So it's logical that it was called leaving no one behind. Pam has told us why historically it came actually from the MDG historicity of the framework, but it's really saying if we want to ensure that we deliver poverty reduction or inequalities reduction, we need to look at the root causes of unsustainability, and that needs to be done in each specific national situation. But in each national situation, we need to completely change the system. The thing is that we have this imperative in Agenda 2030, but there is no instructions manual in how we should do that. And so one key importance, I want to state again why universality is also very important. All countries need to transform. We are all developing countries in that regard if we want to jointly tackle inequalities, inclusion, and environmental integrity. But each country faces specific challenges, specific path dependencies on a model of development, inertia in institutions, but also political factors. And I just want, because this is, I need a little bit to demonstrate what I'm telling you. I think since the adoption of Agenda 2030, we have now a variety, numerous examples that really insist on the fact that we can't deal with reaching Agenda 2030 if we don't look back at past and current trends or unsustainability patterns that explain why we do so bad, we perform so bad on both environmental degradation, inequalities, and exclusion. And this is good. This goes much broader than the concept of just transition, although it is linked to it. We have examples, for instance, from CEPAL, the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and ECLAC in English, for Latin America and the Caribbean, where they produce reports on the inefficiency of inequalities. What they say is inequalities are actually embedded in extractivist models of growth that are oriented on the export of raw materials. And this is both producing inequalities and causing the major threats to the environment. So this is a joint type of problem of a model of development that needs to change if we want to reduce both of them. We have at IDRI developed with colleagues in South Africa, the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative, and the South African report says, inequalities are rooted in the dominance of the mining sector in the structure of the economy and the workforce. This is what maintains an important proportion of the Black workforce in the poverty trap. And this is also what is very bad for climate. So both issues need to be tackled jointly. And I will have examples on the idea of agricultural transformation in countries like Niger or Mali, where you have an important demographic increase. And if you don't look at labor intensity of the growth that you want to install in the agri-food sector, then you might lead to only productivity of land that will not enable you to develop decent jobs for all, and will not enable you to find the type of agroecological innovation and pathway of development that would be good also for climate, biodiversity, and to fight desertification. So this is just to show that these are all the trends that we need to look at jointly. All these elements of research have been produced since the last 5 years that really exemplify that we need to really look at those types of problems jointly if we want to tackle both inclusion and environmental integrity. The last thing that has been produced in the recent years is the Global Sustainable Development Report. It's a very worrying report because it really states that since the last 4 years, I mean, between 2015 and 2019, we have not progressed on many of the SDGs. And in some cases, the situation has even, the distance to target has actually, is actually bigger. So we have to worsen the situation. What I find very important conceptually for our understanding is that be it the Global Sustainable Development Report or the paper by Jeffrey Sachs, Mariana Mazzucato, or Dirk Messner, or Johan Rockström, they both say, we have 17 goals, and this is the imperative. We need to tackle them jointly if we want to go to the root causes of unsustainability. But we can think of that as 6 transformations, 6 entry points for transformation. And then suddenly, if you look at that, for instance, the food systems transformation or the energy system transformation, you suddenly have really very operational ways to look at the question of reaching the SDGs that enable you to say, in the longer term, I can find win-win solutions that are going to be good both for social inclusion, economic development, and environmental integrity. But the important is to avoid being trapped in a path dependency and enable bifurcation from the current pathway of the system. And this is really the way that we can not only assess the distance to target, but also the blocking factors, the levers of change, why we have not changed the pathway until now, and what is the distance to transformation. So again, what I'm saying here is just looking at the fact that now we have everything in place conceptually to implement Agenda 2030 in a way that could really give us the tools to deal with both inclusion, social inclusion, and environmental integrity. But we're already 5 years ahead, and we have only 10 years ahead of us. So this is, to me, very important that we use all these tools to really make Agenda 2030 much more actionable, particularly through these 6 entry points, but also because we need to discuss what is the way that the HLPF, the High-Level Political Forum, could function better. And this is the mission that has been given for between 2019 and 2020 for a revision of the HLPF. I just want to be sure that I'm not, sorry, I'm going the other way around. Yes, there is something that I want to talk about, which is the fact that there is also implicitly a political theory of change behind Agenda 2030. It's not explicit, and at the same time, it's also probably very weak, but it's the best that we can have in terms of realpolitik and strategy. Agenda 2030 is to some extent acknowledging the comeback of the national state. The national state has to develop a planning, is responsible for reaching the SDGs, which does not mean that we underestimate the power of transnational actors that might counteract what national governments are trying to do. So it's not a naive way to look at national state, but I think it was to some extent quite a smart anticipation or response to the fact that we also have citizens in all of our countries that are very worried that they lose the sovereignty over the destiny of their choices, and that they want to be protected with respect to all the very rapid changes that happen with digitalization, for instance, but also with globalization. So the national political space is actually critical for citizens to feel that they have some sovereignty. And that is an important point. But then how do you play with national state with national governments being the ones responsible for implementing Agenda 2030? The implementation of Agenda 2030 is actually organizing a two-level game. Each government states how they expect to reach the SDGs. National civil society and science is supposed to be able to criticize both the endpoint of the pathway and the levers and the pathway chosen to get there, but also criticize the insufficient progress on each of the transformations. But you need to have a political space for civil society to do that in the national context. You could have regional scale discussions that can help identify common challenges and solutions, and we've seen that particularly, for instance, on biodiversity at the scale of Latin America. And then the HLPF could play, but this is not explicit, the role of a kind of an international peer review or peer pressure mechanism, where you would have public policy evaluation, where you would have some kind of identification of the blocking factors, the socio-technical lock-ins, but also exposing political resistance to implementing SDGs or the transformation and the bifurcation that are necessary. And that relies also not just on the intergovernmental discussion, but of course the international civil society being able to play a role of name and shame, and to have independent scientific assessment playing their role also, like the GSDR, but also IPCC, IPBS. And then, of course, it's not just about putting pressure on governments, it's also the idea that we would identify needs for international cooperation, not just in terms of a learning process for each country's individual pathway, but also for common levers of change, particularly on trade and investments and some other things that are particularly crucial that Deb has mentioned already. And I think that's, to me, at least how I understand the underlying theory, political theory of change behind Agenda 2030. And we know that we are very far away from this being completely happening. So what has happened since 2015? Not a lot of that. I think what we've seen is generally overcoming policy silos within government. I think that's happened everywhere. In some cases, you see that not in France, but for instance, better in Germany. You have seen efforts to put Agenda 2030 at the heart of major macroeconomic and political and planning decisions that could enable normally to bifurcate, to reorient the 6 transformations that were mentioned in the GSDR report. You see also that donors and funders have developed some kind of understanding of trying to align their whole portfolio on SDGs, which is something very different from just ticking the boxes. So, and also just not just ensuring that you implement environmental and social safeguards, but go towards accelerating the 6th transformation in a do-good manner. So you have interesting examples, for instance, also, I just mentioned one country, there could be others, where Agenda 2030 was also proposed as a political project with the peace agreement in Colombia. So to me, this is really insufficient if we want to have the political theory of change to be happening, to be inclusive, both within countries and at international scale. I understand that I need to go to my conclusion. Is that right, Carole-Anne?
Yeah, could you please wrap up in 1 minute?
I'll do.
Thank you.
So 2 points. One is, and I won't go into details, I think what we see in the EU is that because there was a political window of opportunity with the elections at the parliament and actually with the recovery plans, we now see that the SDG framework is going to play a key role, or is supposed to play a key role with the European semester to assess if recovery plans are good on jobs, equity, cohesion, resilience, and sustainability. So really playing their role to have a political place in the political debate within Europe for member states, civil society to be able to participate to a debate on the alignment of recovery plans with Agenda 2030. I hope this will happen. That will necessitate a lot of support by researchers and civil society. The other thing that I want to say is we won't have the international, the political theory of change of Agenda 2030 functioning if we are not very cautious about the role of and the political space for global civil society and global science. And I think this means that we need to go back to the fact that there is not enough mention of rights-based approach within Agenda 2030. And for instance, on the environmental side, there is a usefulness to look at what has been developed at regional scale on the participation of civil society with the Aarhus Convention in Europe and the Escazú Agreement in Latin America. This might guarantee much more space for civil society. And the other thing is we might be inspired by what happens actually at the International Labour Organization, because they have organized with the issue of universal access. Their goal is universal access to social protection. And actually that might be a key way to unlock also ecological transition in many places. I think this links to what Deb has been saying. And my last slide, and sorry, Carole-Anne, to have been too long. I think my last slide is just to say, yes, of course, internationally, we need to install as much as possible the rules-based system of the UN, of the participation, complement all those rules, but we also need to recognize power because it's going to be a geopolitical period. And so we need to be very strategic in the way that civil society can link up with some of the governments that are really the champions and other types of players in a vision of distributed leadership, where we need to build these coalitions because the rules are not going to be enough. And so if we want to be inclusive, we need to set the rules, but we need also to play strategically with the champions of inclusiveness globally. Thank you very much for your patience and attention, and thank you for your patience, Carole-Anne, particularly.
No, thank you, Sébastian, for this excellent and very rich presentation. So let me just share my screen again. So we now move into the Q&A discussion. So if you need to refer to the guidelines for participation, you can just click on the link that appears in the chat function, which can be found in the Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. So I have seen that participants have typed in both broader questions and also specific questions to each of our panelists. So I suggest we first address some of the specific ones before dealing with broader issues. So we have first a question from Michelle Scobie from the University of West Indies, which is, I believe, addressed to Deb. So she's asking, how do you see trade-offs being addressed at the household level with persons with multidimensional vulnerabilities? Are these new vulnerabilities really new, or the latest example of pre-existing and systemic vulnerabilities? Deb?
Yes, Carole-Anne, thank you very much. I think there are two questions, in fact, not one, within that. And Dr. Scobie have put on that a very interesting one. And on the first one, on the trade-off at household level, households with multiple multidimensional vulnerabilities is a critical one. The issue is, the most classical example, and how it happens. For example, the most classical example is the investment. Education investment, when the household head deprives the girl child from education and invests in the boy child's education and wants to invest so much, all of the resources, so that the boy can have a better quality education at the cost of the girl child in that way. The issue over here, who makes the decision? I think that will bring you, in this case, let me bring in the very relevant question put by my good friend Gabriel Kohler, that whether the power relationship, how it comes over here. It's the issue is whether this decision is a sovereign decision by the household head, or it is because of the milieu or the compulsion within the context, which is given to the person to take that decision. And the power relationship is very obvious, and obviously the girl child is not taking the decision in this case. Regarding the new vulnerabilities are not solved, I partly agree that some of the new vulnerabilities are exacerbation of the old entrenched vulnerabilities, but there are also new vulnerabilities. Let me tell you, usually that, give example on that. As I mentioned, that one of the major areas where we see that new vulnerability showing up is the service sector, hospitality sector, and retail trades and elsewhere. So take, for example, the case, what we have now is in case of the print media. The print media, the circulation has dropped, collapsed. Some of them have stopped publishing, and all of a sudden, a very well-paid, the relatively well-paid media person was out of job. So the coping, again, coming back on the model, that whether you have the coping capacity and resilience to go for how long. So here is also the time dimension will come in. The person may go on without a social protection and without a salary for 6 months. The person may not be able to go for 1 year or so, even with these savings and everything else. So we are seeing traditionally non-poor are also joining the vulnerability rank. So it is not in the traditional poor sense of the term. And the lower middle class is the closest one on that. And we have seen that the children is not paying fees to the school teacher, as a result not getting the salary. That a result, they're not being able to pay their boys tuition fees. It's a circular motion as it's going on. So there are new vulnerabilities. That is the new challenge, to have a look at that. But I agree that these are interesting questions, demands empirical evidence. And I also fully support Gabriel's point of power relationship, asymmetric power relationship, not adequately being recognized in the SDG implementation issues.
Great, thank you, Deb. We also have a question for Sheila. Erwin Medina is writing from Mexico, from the initiative Red Agenda 2030 Mexico. So he's writing in Mexico regarding renewable energy. Unfortunately, an agenda has been prioritized with the current government that benefits and prioritizes the continuity in the use of fossil fuels for the generation of electrical energy, and this will occur until 2024. Meanwhile, other countries such as Chile recently presented its 2050 energy plan prioritizing renewable energy. What is missing in international governance for all countries to advance in the same direction, in this case, pro SDG 7? Sheila, would you like to elaborate on this question?
Yes, thank you very much for that, for the question. I'm happy to speak to. I completely agree with the comments that have been made. That we are seeing a lot of diversity in how countries are responding to the goal, the target on 7.2, to increase the share of renewable energy in the global mix. And of course, if it's going to increase in the global mix, you're going to have to increase it at the national mix. Here, I'd like to, I think what you specifically was asked, what is missing? I think what is missing is basically political will. I think also what is missing is the way the different member states interpret the SDGs. So if you look at the, like I said, I was engaged in the SDG process from the beginning. To begin with, the proposed target at the beginning was on 7.2 was to increase by double the share of renewable energy in the global mix, but it was, I don't want to, with all due respect, I don't want to say watered down, but you can see that that has changed. They've removed a specific target of doubling the share to increase substantially. So the interpretation of substantially by every member state is left open to own resources and capacity. So I think that's one. Secondly, you also note that in the SDGs also actually, so the SDG indicator of 12C has been developed to monitor the share of, I'm just looking at it here, it measures fossil fuel subsidies, amount of fossil fuel subsidies per unit GDP on production and consumption. I personally am not involved in sustainable development in SDG 12, so I'm not sure how it has been measured. I do know that UNEP is the United Nations Energy Program is responsible for that. But I can imagine that the discussions and negotiations are very difficult. We have also seen, I think also, let's say that the political context that we're currently in, and I think also led by some of the key development partners, point in case I will mention not just OPEC, but also in America, the United States, have brought coal and fossil fuels back onto the agenda. So a lot of progress was being made, and that can be seen as reported by the SDG 7 custodians. We have a substantial increase in the share of renewable energy to 16.3% now of total energy consumption comes from renewables. But I think, like I said at the beginning, a lot of this progress is subject to political discussions, political priorities for trade, political priorities for economic growth. So fully agree. What the international community can do about it, I think that there needs to be far more, there needs to be stronger binding targets on the, both on the fossil fuels, but also on increasing the share. And I think setting an actual target rather than increase substantially under the SDG 7 on energy, I think will go a long way to addressing that problem. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sheila. We now move to the next question, who's addressed to Sébastian. And again, from Michelle Scobie from the University of the West Indies. She's asking, are these 6 entry points useful, applicable to all developing and developed countries in the same way? And what differences do you see or would you suggest in terms of SDG implementation?
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this key question. I think what I like, I mean, I'm not the author of these 6 transformations, but to some extent it relates to the work that we have done at IDRI on the deep decarbonization pathways. What we say is that in general, if you look at the energy system or the food system, none of the countries can go reach the SDGs without a radical change of pathway in these systems. But I definitely would be able to at least make one distinction, because there might be many, it's all very context dependent. But one distinction is that when we have a very developed and industrialized food system like in Europe, we know that there are pathways from which it's very difficult to to change, that we are locked in, that there are situations, to use the words of the sociology of innovation, that we have socio-technical lock-ins in the way that we have developed an industrial food system in Europe. So the idea would be that when there are countries where the system is much less industrialized already, and I mean by industrialization also the concentration of power in the food industry, for instance, that you should avoid. There are ways to leapfrog the solutions and not go through what we have done on the industrialization of our agricultural system and food system in Europe. So the idea would be to say there are situations of lock-ins, there are path dependencies that you need to be aware of and that you can avoid when you're at critical decision and bifurcation points. And that's probably the type of learning process that can happen around these 6 transformation pathways that are much more concrete than what you could have looking generally at the 17 SDGs overall, but nevertheless, giving space for each country understanding that they have a specific situation, a specific initial point of departure. And I think that's how I would say that these 6 transformations are probably much more operational and still not saying that we have uniform solutions to be implemented in every country, but rather that we can learn from one another.
Great, thank you, Sébastian. So our next, or actually most voted question now comes from Frank Bierman from Utrecht University, and it is primarily addressed to Dr. Bhattacharya, to Deb. But I would like to ask this question to all of our panelists. Do we need a global universal minimum income? Dr. Deb, would you like to start?
I wonder if we have a universal global minimum income, which country we are going to pick. That would be an interesting question. Do you go to the lowest common denominator or the highest common enumerator in that way? No, I don't think so. Under the current circumstances, I think it is very much a national agenda, like the minimum wage issue. It has number of contextual factors, starting from the fiscal possibilities, the fiscal availability, and along with also the competitiveness issue that each of the country, as they compete as a nation state in the market, their ability to pay for their own human resources, and particularly the productive forces, will be a major determinant. So I don't think it is at this moment only as an aspirational thing one can think of. But I don't think at this moment this is a practical agenda on the table. Country-specific discussion, given their own monetary system, own fiscal system, and their context, will be the determinant one. The very fundamental point is, how do you define the national minimum wage? That itself is a major issue. Whether it is double the poverty line, or it will be a part of the assigned part of the GDP. This is something which is there, and it is very much related to the other issues, where the role of the state in terms of providing welfare and social protection. So that itself is also a complex issue. So each of the countries will have to sort it out in their own way. Thank you. At this moment, at least.
Great, thanks, Deb. Sheila, would you also like to react?
I think that the response given was excellent. I don't have so much to say. I think I would just complement that to say that I think a much more important measure is really the quality of life, able to access a job, and those type of socioeconomic indicators we've had in many countries, and a lot of also in the work that we do, we have used minimum wage as an indicator, but what we've found is that on the ground, that doesn't necessarily translate to what I mentioned, improving the measurements of well-being or the measurements of productivity. I also do agree that, you know, what standard, what benchmark are you going to take? And that this maybe is, if you are going to do something, then it's probably going to have to be a national indicator. But again, income is not necessarily the best measure of well-being, of welfare, and of productivity.
Great, thank you, Sheila. Sébastian?
I think, again, I would concur with the two other speakers that it's not necessarily the minimum, what was exactly the wording, the minimum wage,
income.
The minimum income that I would go for. But I really concur with what Deb was saying, that if we want to have, I mean, that was one of the conclusions I want to get to with my presentation. There are issues with globalization today that make that in many cases when we want to operate ecological transition, the main argument to resist it for good reasons is to say, but the same, if we do that, we are going to be in competition with others where the workforce is much cheaper. So the race to the bottom in terms of workforce income and social protection of workforce is actually a critical problem for reaching all the SDGs. And to some extent, I'm tempted to say if we need to really support the International Labour Organization's purpose, that is putting on the agenda the capacity to access the universal access to social protection, which would be a broader framing than only universal income. That to me is the type of thing that we need to work on. And I just want to really draw your attention to the fact that the ILO is a very specific multilateral organization because it's not just governments, it's governments and social partners, meaning companies and trade unions. And that type of negotiation might be really something where the balance of power is a little bit different, not majoritarily different. It's a little bit different than what we experience in other purely intergovernmental fora.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. I think we have the time for one last question that is addressed to the entire panel. It comes from Joek Ogenhuis, and I'm really sorry for mispronouncing Dutch. Joek comes from Utrecht University, and he's asking, what are your thoughts on the most holistic problems out there, such as gender and racial inequality, problems that seem to touch upon many other challenges as well? The integration of addressing these challenges and the response to all other challenges seems to sometimes undermine them as priorities. Any ideas on how this can be best addressed? Deb, would you like to start?
Yeah, no, this will take us back to the old debate of vertical inequality versus horizontal inequality debate on that. And here, whether once again inequality is defined in terms of only in terms of not income, but also in terms of opportunities and also in terms of the other prospects. So that is, I do not disagree that gender inequality and racial inequality in some cases, which may include also indigenous people's issues. And there are other forms of, not only racial inequality. Nowadays, we see religious discrimination also on the rise and various kinds of issues associated with those. So I think these are very important things. The issue is that the challenge is that whether opening up economic opportunities and social well-being is going to be a necessary condition towards addressing this type of inequalities, in the sense that how do you sequence measures which addresses the vertical inequality in order to unlock or to address the horizontal inequalities. So that is the way to look at it. But again, I will come back and say that although they are quite universal, all these problems, but I'm a great fan of looking into concretely and discretely within the history of certain countries and to address them and not to forget the global history in that respect. We are seeing that what is happening at this very moment regarding the Black Lives Matters campaign, the upheaval. So it is there, but again, each of us will have to look at it in the very concrete context to address these specific issues with policy interventions, because it will demand policy interventions. My general point is that, yes, policy interventions are important, but social mobilization, social empowerment is the sufficient condition in order to get these things out from our everyday life in that way. So I cannot agree more on that, but the issue is, how do you place them as a applied policy person? How do you place them in the policy package? And how do you really put the political packaging into this with social packaging along with that? Thank you very much. We do have 1 minute, half a minute, to one of the question I saw in the chat box, the future of 2030.
Half a minute. Yeah.
I thought that is a very, very, very fantastic question.
Sorry, Deb,
University, would you like to discuss that?
Hello, Deb. Could I just respond? Dev, could I just respond to the question on the inequalities before we come to the future of 2020?
Sure. I just wanted to alert Carole-Anne on that. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much. Carole-Anne, if you don't mind, could I just come in?
Sure, go ahead, Sheila. Yeah, we don't have much time, so yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
No, and I think I'm not going to be long, but I fully agree with everything that Deb said. But I wanted to say why I was enthusiastic to respond to this is not just the context of what we are seeing now with the Black Lives Matter campaign, but also from my own personal experience. But I'll bring it back to the last point that I made, which might have seen in the slide, although I didn't speak to it directly. You might also be aware that in the SDGs, and bring it back to the SDGs, we do have an overarching principle where we are supposed to disaggregate across all the SDGs by income, sex, age, rate, ethnicity, migration status, disability. But there's also says where relevant. So again, there is wording here that includes, that allows for member states to make a choice to decide where it is relevant. So with SDG 7, we find that indeed work has been done in the humanitarian space on migration, on geographical location, rural and urban. But where it becomes very difficult, and nobody is really touching that, is the issue about ethnicity and also with race. And I think I myself have been a bit disappointed with how this overarching indicator is being reported on at the high-level political forum. And there I'll go back to Sébastian's comments about needing to review the high-level political forum, I think both in terms of the format, but also in what is its purpose and what is set to do. I also think one of the challenges is, and here back to gender equality, we do have the Convention on the Elimination of All Discrimination against Women, CEDAW, and there's in fact a reporting system, both formal and a shadow reporting system to that. Unfortunately, this is done under the CSW, Commission for the Status of Women, and not necessarily linked sufficiently to the SDG and the high-level political forum. So you don't necessarily have countries being asked to report on CEDAW, which does have a very strong emphasis on age and on race and on ethnicity. I would say much stronger than SDGs. So I think it's some of these siloed reporting systems that we find within the UN state, as well as not enough accountability on reporting on the overarching disaggregation by different aspects. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sheila. Sébastian, some final words before I close the session?
I would be sorry, I don't want to speak instead of Deb, but on this issue of discrimination, I believe that some of the things that we need to look at is really being pragmatic about the fact that many of the economic planning decisions in country are actually also embedding continuation of discriminations. And that's what I was trying to say with my slide, saying that the way Latin American countries are putting the emphasis on an extractivist model of growth is actually continuing discrimination within the countries. And that could be also another entry point. We need to look at the discrimination per se, but we through the SDG framework, we also have some leeway to really question those types of macroeconomic political decisions that are linked and causes and consequences of political and group discriminations within the countries.
Great. Thank you, Sébastian. I'm sorry, Deb, but we now have to close the session, but I'm sure we will have many other opportunities to discuss inclusiveness in the parallel sessions. So I would like now to thank you all for this very inspiring presentations and discussion. Thank you to our three panelists for sharing their insights on such an essential topic. And I also thank participants for their constructive questions and comments. And for participants in time zones that permit, we reconvene in half an hour, that is at 4 p.m. Central European Summer Time, for the first round of parallel sessions. Thank you all and enjoy.
Thank you, Chair. Good sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the excellent participation for the sharing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Carole-Anne. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you all.